Hi, I'm Chuck Braverman. This is another episode of Westdoc Online. Today we have one of the shortlisted documentary features, 20 Days in Mariupol, and we have the director, cameraman, writer. And before we begin, I want to remind you, as usual, we're brought to you in part by Real Screen. Real Screen Summit is coming up very soon in New Orleans. If you haven't been, you could go to our Westdoc Online website and scroll down to the bottom of the front page, and there's the icon. Click on it. It'll give you all the information for registration. And if you're looking at this sometime in the future, they have Real Screen Summits every 6 months or so, Real Screen West and Real Screen Summit. And if you're a nonfiction business, you should be there. There's buyers, sellers, wannabes, superstars, and it's a great place to be. So today we have the writer, cinematographer, and director. How do you pronounce your first name? Mstyslav?
Mstislav.
Mstyslav.
Yeah,
That's a tricky one for Mstyslav Chernov. And you're speaking from where right now, if I may
I'm in
ask?
Palm Springs right now.
At
Yeah, it
probably, if I
is.
may guess, the Palm Springs Film Festival. Is that
Yeah,
right?
Palm Springs Film Festival. Yeah, it is a drastic change from being in Ukraine and then being there on the front lines and seeing how things are still unfolding violently and Russia keeps attacking all the cities, same as it was in the very beginning of the full-scale invasion, and just fly here to present the film. But it's it's an absurd feeling, but it's a necessary thing to do.
Well, ironically, I was actually just in Palm Springs myself the last couple of days, and I must say it's a radical change, even coming from the Los Angeles area to Palm Springs, because you feel like you're really out there in the desert. And have you had your screening yet for the audience in Palm Springs?
We had a screening at the first day of the festival, and we have a screening right after our conversation. So I am getting ready to that too. The
Tell me,
response has been very good.
wha- what is the response like for an audience seeing this? Because this is a very heavy, dramatic, strong cinema verite film, but it's kind of shocking too. How did they react?
It's a very interesting question actually because we have been on the road for almost a year since Sundance, since we opened the Sundance, and in the very beginning when we didn't know yet how the audience will react on the film, it is at times emotionally hard to watch. The first screening was we were so nervous, but audience not just accepted the film, not just watched through it, but also we got an audience awards at the Sundance. And since then, the film went a long way. Uh, the most emotional screenings were in Ukraine where actually residents of Mariupol who ran away, who lost their homes and their families, they watched the film, and that was so emotional, so so strong. Again, we were afraid and worried that it might traumatize them, but in fact, on the contrary, it just helped them to get over the trauma because they've experienced this film, they experienced these tragedies together in the cinema, which is a safe environment, and they experienced it as a community, and they kept thanking us for for preserving the memory of the city because at the time where when we live in a time when we are bombarded by tragedies. We live in a time when we every day something terrible happens, and we hear that from coming from everywhere, screens, uh, newspapers, and we forget tragedies that happened yesterday. So making a documentary, it's almost the only way to kind of preserve this story, to preserve an important message or a symbol or a city which doesn't exist anymore. So, and in this throughout this year, questions and feelings became responses were very different. Now there are a lot of political questions. Now the film became even more actual, more urgent than before because the support for Ukraine is fading, and some of the audiences see the necessity to show this film to politicians for kind of convincing them to keep supporting Ukraine. So this film suddenly became not just a film, but also a symbol of something more, symbol of necessity to support Ukraine, a symbol of what is sometimes happening in other countries, like in Gaza, for example. So all that, as the time passes, layers and layers of meaning just are adding to it, and it's fascinating to see that.
Let's take a look at the trailer now.
Someone once told me, wars don't start with explosions. They start with silence.
Лично видим визуально. Танки зашли с надписью Z.
Город Мариуполь блокирован со всех сторон.
Russians have entered the city. The war has begun, and we have to tell its story.
Хорошо, что тут есть пресса. Снимайте.
This is painful to watch, but it must be painful to watch.
Вони нанесли бомбовий удар. Вон там! Хирургический корпус! Вот там вот!
А, вы госпитале, да?
Мамочка!
Не знаешь, куда бежать.
Чего расстраиваешься?
Не хочу, чтобы я умирала.
Репортажи ваши разошлись. Конечно, огромное дело.
Они столько пережили с мамами.
If the world saw everything that happened in Mariupol, it would give at least some meaning to this horror. My brain will desperately want to forget all this, but the camera will not let it happen.
Where is the film playing now? Is it just at festivals, and will it be released theatrically? And I know it's PBS and Frontline is involved, so when is that also happening?
Right. So we had its festival run. Now we are in the end of our festival run, and we already had a theatrical premiere in summer, and it was separate, quite interesting experience because it was at the same time, it came out at the same time as Oppenheimer and Barbie. So we would see posters in cinemas, Oppenheimer, Barbie, 20 Days in Mariupol, all together. And
The perfect weekend trio of films.
yeah, that weekend was that weekend was very, very intense. But people came, and we opened in Film Forum in New York, and they've extended the run for a few weeks. So that meant a lot, that people came and saw the film while there was an Oppenheimer and a Barbie playing at the same time. And yeah, now we're finishing the festival cycle, and now the film is available on streaming on the Frontline website, on the YouTube, on other streaming services. So it is available for general public, and also
It's
it's
online.
even available in Russia.
It's online now on YouTube?
Yes.
Free or
Yes.
for cost?
Yes, free.
Well,
In US.
anybody who's watching this now, anytime, I strongly recommend, if you have any doubts about the war, you should definitely go see this film. I watched it again last night, I can't even begin to tell you. I mean, I had a very strong emotional reaction. How did this come about? I mean, I know that you are an award-winning journalist for Associated Press in Ukraine, and you're out there. Well, I mean, the first question is, and then you were asked, everybody's saying, when is this going to be over? You're there like for 3 days, and they're thinking it's going to be over on Saturday. But how did you even know when nobody else seemed to think that there was going to be a war going on? Did you just take a guess, or did you? I mean, I know that the Russians were lining up outside the borders, but it seemed to come as quite a shock to a lot of people in Mariupol.
In Mariupol, for a lot of Ukrainians and for the world, it came as a shock. But at the same time, there were a lot of signs of that this time is going to be very different. And we, as a Ukrainian, as all Ukrainians, live in a state of Russia's invasion in Ukraine for 9 years, or even more now. But at that point, it was 8 years. So it's not something new that we didn't expect. There was always a possibility that there will be escalation, that there will be new wave of the invasion. Same thing that happened in 2014 when Russia invaded and took part of Ukraine and negotiated to have it, and the world didn't really react much on that, and that is what I'm afraid is happening right now. For Ukrainians, it was inevitable. We didn't know when it's going to happen and how it's going to happen, whether it's going to be just Donbass or it's going to be the whole country. But the feeling was there, and there were several kind of important signs. Also, if you monitor Russian news and Russian media, you would have these signs. They're preparing their people for certain things to happen. So there were small signs of things that things will happen very soon, and it was just up to us to decide where exactly we are going to be when they hit. And Mariupol seemed to be so important, so symbolic. We've spent there a lot of time before, during these years. It was always very close to the front line. Evgeny, our photographer, was born near Mariupol. So we felt like, and I was born in Kharkiv, but that's a very, very similar city to Mariupol. So that community is very close to us, and it was important to be there and to show what's happening if Russia attacks, and they did. And then the second decision which we had to make is whether we stay or not when we realized that it will be surrounded. And everybody made, like all the international journalists have made a decision to leave. We decided to stay because we were kind of confident that we will be able to keep working, but also we felt a responsibility to stay and report. So, and also at that moment, I was already kind of feeling that Mariupol is such a huge symbol, such an important image, such an important event in the city, in this invasion, that I need to do more. Like it deserves a bigger story. So the idea of making a film came when we broke out of the city, because the main priority was just to survive while we were in the city. But the understanding that this is a bigger story than just 1 minute or 2 minute news pieces was already there when we were there.
And how did you get connected with PBS?
Right. AP already has a collaboration with PBS. We made several films together already. They're different films, not like this one, but this collaboration was already established. So when we came out of Mariupol, I had 30 hours of footage, and out of those 30 hours, maybe 40 minutes were published at that moment, because we didn't have any connection, because it was so hard to communicate with the outside world. such a phenomenon that in a city of 500,000 people, there are only 3 journalists stuck. So I felt we need to do more. I felt I need to do more with these 30 hours, and there was so much unpublished footage. And I started looking into what to do, and this collaboration just came in, and Michel Meister, the frontline editor, came in, and Rainy Aronson, the chief producer on the project. So it just all came together, and it just worked. We started looking for a right tone, for the right way to tell the story. I've started looking for survivors, those people who you see in our stories from Mariupol, and we find a lot of them. And I've recorded hours and hours of interviews with them, and I thought that's going to be a basis for the film in the beginning. So we're going to be intercutting and interviews of survivors with an archive footage. But then it just didn't feel like a right decision. Because we wanted to make this film as close as possible to the real experience of being inside the besieged city, to be trapped. Like, people who sit in the cinema should feel trapped too, as I did, or as people of Mariupol were. So then we decided that probably we wouldn't go out of the story into these interviews, and we keep the story right within these 20 days, and to keep the focus as narrow as possible.
It's funny, I hadn't thought of this before, and this is a really silly question in a way, but I as a young kid, I was a freelance stringer cameraman, and I had a small little camera, 16 millimeter, and I put myself in a lot of positions that I shouldn't have. I was 16, 17, 18 years old. But when I had my camera in front of me, I remember in hindsight feeling like I had a shield in front of me, like a big shield protecting me. I feel stupid even asking the question, but, I know you have 2 young children and a family. Did you feel like you had a magic shield, or did you feel more or less vulnerable than you think others, or what?
It's a very good question. When I just started conflict journalism, that was almost 10 years ago, in 2014, when Russia attacked Ukraine. Everything we learned, right? It was a crash course of a conflict journalism. All the conflict photographers and videographers just suddenly became, in Ukraine, they suddenly became war correspondents. Since then, I've been through different wars. I've been in Iraq and in Syria and Afghanistan and Nagorno-Karabakh and Gaza, and nowhere I felt like a camera is the shield. In fact, on contrary, because after you've seen what you've seen, you keep watching and re-watching and re-experiencing the same thing, same tragedies over and over, through your footage, through your photos, through your videos, through your text stories, if you write. So it's actually worse. Add to that a responsibility, especially the way it happened in Mariupol. People just kept coming to us and saying, record, show this to the world, keep recording, keep sending this, film me, film this. There were different ones who said bad things, but most of the people were just like coming straight to us and saying, you have to record this. So it was an additional responsibility. The camera actually added a weight to the fact that we just needed to survive and kind of find food and water, and just not to die from the bombs and not to be captured by Russians, because that was another danger we were very, very aware of. And as an example, Mstyslav Chernov, a Lithuanian filmmaker who was at the same time with us in Mariupol. We didn't meet him, but he was there at the same time. And as he was leaving the same way we did, just slightly later, he was captured and executed on the Russian checkpoint. So we were very aware of that too. I feel that in the modern world, where information suddenly became a weapon for many countries, journalists are targets. So yeah, that makes it just harder.
When you were in this convoy at the very end, leaving and going through the 15 Russian checkpoints, what are the logistics of the camera gear and the hard drives? I mean, I assume that you had the small DSLR type cameras. You mentioned Sony before, but what about the hard drives? You have 30 hours of materials. How many megabytes or terabytes was that, and how many drives did you have, and what did you do with them?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because we had several different options of how to deal with this footage before leaving. One option was to leave it in the city and then try to ask someone to pick it up when dust settles. But the footage was so important, and there was so much unpublished footage which we needed to publish as soon as possible. Then that was not a good option. Another option was to give it to someone who is not a journalist, someone just a regular folks who are leaving the city as well. But then it would mean endanger them. That was not an option too. So yeah, we decided to risk and to take it with us. And it was a bit messy because there were cards. I was out of space completely. There were SD cards. There were hard drives, several hard drives. One small tiny SD card, a micro SD card. So all that was kind of hidden in different places in the car, and the car was pierced by shrapnel, so the doors wouldn't open, and there were no windows. It was just like a scotch tape. So that was a good distraction. They couldn't even get in the car to check it on the checkpoint. That was good, and the micro SD card was hidden in our producer's tampon. So that's a very good way to smuggle the footage. You hide micro SD in a tampon, and then you hide tampon. That's like the most important one. You have to do that. But yeah, and it worked. It worked. It was just so much luck in that as well, because the first days of the Green Corridor, first 2 days, was absolute chaos. Thousands of people leaving, and FSB still hasn't set up the system and lists, and people were still kind of just passing the checkpoints. The next day, they started already undressing people, checking their phones with the special programs. There were lists of people who they're looking for. So it was just the right timing.
What was the size of the people? I was going to say crew, but I'm assuming it was 3 or 4 people that you were with.
Yeah.
Or?
So the standard crew in a war zone for an agency would be 3-4 people. We were 3. It's me, the cameraman. Then there is a photographer, Evgeny Maloletka, and a producer, Vasilisa Stepanenko. Producer is a field producer, so she would stay in contact with an office, with editors. She would be handling the follow-ups with people who we talk to, who we record, take care of a lot of things. So every single member of the team is just invaluable. But sometimes teams are even smaller. You know, the way the news journalists operate is a bit different from the documentary filmmakers, from film crews. They're small. The kits are small, compact. The sound system is also very small and compact. Everything's compact. Everything is directed just to shoot and send. And having a luxury of the editing process for the film took about 6 months, the initial editing process, 5 to 6 months. And that was such a luxury because as a news camera person, as a journalist, I am so used to shoot and edit within a couple hours. As I'm entering the scene, I am already editing in my head what I see, and I shoot according to my editing in my head. Obviously, not all the time, but that process is just so quick and automated. And actually, some of the footage, some of the parts of the edit you see in a film were just taken straight out of the news sequences. So that passed on to the film.
There are a lot of filmmakers who watch this series regularly, and they often want to know what kind of gear, physically, actual gear. Can you tell us what camera you used and and the sound guy? Did he have a boom or wireless and that sort of stuff, or recorder?
Yeah, the kit is very compact and simple. I use Sony mirrorless cameras. You usually have two. One is half broken always in a war zone, and that's normal. So yeah, two mirrorless cameras. One is the primary one. One is as a backup one. A top directional mic, shotgun mic on the top of the camera, and a small recorder for the interviews, or actually two recorders. DJI recorders just to put on someone when you are interviewing, and the laptop, and that's pretty much it. Yeah, nothing else. A small light for the dark environments, but that's not that usual because Sonys are so good in the low light. Two lenses, one universal lens, 24-240. That's 90% of everything you see in this film was shot by that lens.
What was the focal length? 24 to
24-240. It's
24
very
to
simple.
140
to 240 to 240. So I am
24
able
to 240. Wow.
Yes, so that is actually a focal length which loosely brings you back to 16 millimeter cameras. And that's very, very convenient because while you're almost not moving, you're able to very quickly to cover the scene with wide shots and close-ups and make sure the sequencing is there. When you are operating with a single focal length, I have 35, 1.4 for darker environments, for example. Sometimes wider angle, but when you have a fixed focal length, it's much harder to get the coverage for the scene. I really like on the editing. I really like to be able to to be invisible in the editing. So go from wides to close-ups and just to continue building the scene. That's where 24-240 shines. I wish Sony has updated that lens. It's a very old lens, and I really want them to update it for a newer version. That would make my life so much easier. But I hope they hear me. But yeah, that's just the style. That's just the style I use.
What would you say to a young film student or journalism student just getting out of school right now about the potential of getting into conflict journalism? Would you advise them to get in or avoid like the plague?
Yeah, well, look, I got into conflict journalism because the war started in my country. For some of my colleagues, that has been a defining, and for me too, it has been a defining moment in my career. But it has been so, I've attached to that profession because it started in my country, because it felt so personal. So I feel there is a trend, and it's a right way to do it. The trend that we should see the world around us, and we should see the world around us through the eyes of people who live in this world. So I would say that the first thing for the young filmmaker is to focus on something that is happening around them, the problems in the community which is around them, because that's very relevant and that's very accessible. I see a lot of filmmakers or documentary photographers who say, "Oh, I want to travel the world. I want to go to all these conflicts." And I say, "Hey, but you have things unfolding right next to you. Is That's the opportunity." So yeah, find topics and themes near you. Also because the world it seems to be on fire right now. And further we go, more of these problems will be evident, more of these problems will be urgent, and every single country will have some stories, some urgent stories to be told. So as soon as you become professional telling stories in your country, then you start moving around. But before that, you have to know several languages. Surprisingly, that is something that I learned on the way. That to actually be in a conflict journalism, to be a good journalist, you have to know 3, 4, 5 languages, because you just can't go deeper into people's stories if you don't understand them.
Where did you learn English, which is exceedingly good, obviously?
I'm a writer, so I studied English on my own, but through cinema, through books, through work, and through work in AP and Associated Press, through writing. So I guess that's just, again, it's just a survival thing.
You speak Russian too, I assume, or no?
I do speak Russian. Obviously, Ukrainian is my mother tongue, but I was born in a city which is right next to Russia, 40 kilometers, which is like 20 miles from Russia, and that means Russian is my second language. Obviously, and it's quite interesting that so many of my friends had just spoke Russian for the whole life, and now they don't want to even say a word. They just pass on to Ukrainian, and that's it. A curious fact: 99% of everything you hear in 20 Days in Mariupol is in Russian. Hence the irony of Russians saying that they're just trying to save Russian-speaking population of Ukraine. They're just bombing and killing them. But yeah, almost.
Why is that? If most of the people there are Ukrainian that you're filming, why are they speaking Russian? Just because of the geography of where they are and their.
Yeah, because of geography. Because a lot of eastern Ukrainian cities have just two mother tongues: Ukrainian as a primary one, and Russian as Ukrainian as official, a primary one for schools, for universities, for the government, for everywhere, and a Russian one sometimes, for the families or street conversations. Several cities in eastern Ukraine would be like that. Obviously, again, we are seeing a shift. We are seeing a shift towards usage of Ukrainian language much more than Russian right now in eastern Ukraine, and that's interesting. I think that itself deserves a story. That itself deserves a documentary. This cultural shift that caused by war and by Russia's aggression in Ukraine, and how that part of a Ukrainian identity, which was there, like a connection to Russia, just was torn away by this invasion. I think that's a very interesting topic. Language is a very interesting topic.
Do you monitor, read, listen to Russian, current, contemporary Russian news / propaganda and have a feel for at all about how it is accepted within Russia in relation to the war?
Yes, and that's a very interesting topic, and it's a very interesting question. There are several layers to that. So the first layer is, I have to say, one of the reasons why it felt so important to make 20 Days in Mariupol a film, is the fact that as a news person, I know that there's just no way, there are no black holes of information in the media space. And Mariupol, for a while, became a black hole. Nothing was coming out from there. Nothing was going in. And until now, we know very little of what is happening in the city and what was happening. Almost everything we know about what was happening in the city during the siege, which was 86 days, is from what we filmed. And it's definitely not enough. So there is a huge... Everything else was deleted on checkpoints. Everything else was just not recorded. So it was very important to preserve every single shot. And that kind of just being confirmed by Russia making mini-series, scripted feature mini-series about Mariupol, filmed in Mariupol. I just saw it yesterday. It came out in Russian news. The news that they made this film about Mariupol, scripted, and they shot it in Mariupol because they have access to the city. And it's coming next month, and so it's coming out in February. It's called 2022 Mariupol. So, hence, it's not a coincidence. They are trying to overtake a Google search, for example, and it's quite interesting to see how they trying to construct the false narrative, the false history with scripted films. Considering that there's so little information preserved of what happened in Mariupol. So I find that fascinating. This attempt to rewrite the history of the city by just making a fiction films, and that's one. And two, there are a couple of very strong narratives right now in Russia. One, I would say it's in internal narrative, and one is external. They are exporting, and then the internal narrative is that they are currently fighting not Ukrainians; they're fighting with US and with Europe. So sometimes in their news, they would even skip Ukraine altogether, and they would say, NATO forces did this, NATO forces did that, and we are fighting NATO. So Russians believe that they are currently at war with US and Europe. And that's not a joke, because if Europe and US doesn't know that Russia is at war with them, it's very dangerous. It leads to disaster. And the second narrative, which you can clearly see in the Russian news, and that is an export narrative, a narrative that US is, and NATO for that extension, is unreliable, weak partner, and they use Ukraine as an example for the fact that now the support to Ukraine is failing. For now, let's say. They use this narrative to export it to Asia, to South America, to Africa, and say, hey, look, US is weak, US is not supporting its allies, so just forget about them, come to us. These are two main narratives. I think it's so important that this is in perspective with US citizens and with European citizens, because they don't seem to notice this at all. That's dangerous. The whole journey was like a miracle. Surviving Mariupol was a miracle, and the fact that we were able to do a film out of that experience is a miracle. The fact that the film went so far and had such a big reach is a miracle. So every single step up from surviving Mariupol is already a miracle. But yeah, the whole an Oscar race, if you can call it a race, is a very very strange and new for me. And my mind is still in Ukraine. You know, I have to shoot a new project, and I'm shooting a new film. So I'm thinking mostly about that.
I should have asked you, what is your next project? I forgot.
We are working on I'm working on a film about the counteroffensive, a difficult counteroffensive that did not reach all the goals that it had in mind, and I wanted to look deeper into soldiers' minds. This time, 20 Days in Mariupol is largely about civilians and an impact of war on a civilian population. But at the same time, you know, the soldiers on the front lines, they are civilians who just took up their arms and go to protect their country. Sometimes they're facing an absurd risks and very hard decisions, losing friends. And I feel that there is something to be said about it. It's very hard to get to the bottom of soldiers' motivation, actually, because they have this image of themselves, of how they should be on camera, right? So it is much harder to make a story of a soldier rather than a story of a civilian.
Are they drafted or are they volunteer mostly?
The story I'm telling is the story of volunteers. There are a lot of drafted people as well. But I'm interested in those people who make the conscious choice to risk their life for a symbol, mostly, because they're fighting for cities that have been obliterated, for forests that have been chopped down to nothing.
So here's
still far.
One other question I meant to ask.
Sure.
What does your wife think of your job and what you're doing and the risks that you're taking?
Let's say this job is, it was for a very long time, very destructive for anyone who is in this line of work for many years. For almost a decade, I've been doing war journalism, and it's destructive to your personal life. So it is very important to find people who understand that conviction, who are able to carry that understanding throughout years. But when I was making this film, I wanted to be able to, in many years when my daughters grow up, to show it to them if they want to, and say, hey, so that is why I haven't been near you when it was so important. That is the reason, and that's what I've been doing. So it's a complex. War is destructive in so many ways, and it has so much impact on psychology, on families. So there's no easy answer to that. But it was important for me when I was making the film. It was important for me that this is going to be a message for the future for my daughters. When they ask me, what did you do at that time? Did you do anything? So, yeah, that's going to be an answer for them.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being a guest on Westdoc. I think this is a very important film and a very important issue, obviously, and I wish you the best of luck in the future, and I look forward to seeing your next films.
Thank you.
Куда вы хотите?
Вопрос только в вами.
Куда? О, блин! Выбили, куда дальше? Куда садиться? Машины не целые!
Девочки, потихоньку, мама ждет.
Все.
Заходите. Тихо. Спокойно. Без паники. Осторожно. Вниз. Без паники. Поднимите.
Обратно.
Выше, выше, поднимите. Выше.